lesson just not bothering to plan? That's a question for TEFLologists. When I read this book, is it better to skim or scan? That's a question for TEFLologists. Can you be a good teacher if you have a CELTA? Or should you invest in an MA or a Delta? From politics to methodology, we'll discuss them all on TEFLology.
Hello, I'm Matthew.
I'm Rob.
And I'm Matt.
And welcome back to TEFLology, a podcast about teaching English as a foreign language and related matters, presented by three self-certified TEFLologists.
TEFL News.
For this week's TEFL News section, I'd like to talk about a recent study that was conducted by a group of academics in Spain and America. The title of the study is Your Morals Depend on Language.
Interesting.
Okay, and the study itself was conducted earlier this year, in March of this year. Before we get into the study itself, you're both learning foreign languages, and you both interact in foreign languages. Rob in Japanese.
Yes.
Matt in...
Also in Japanese, mainly, these days. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe just think about your experiences for a second. Have you ever had to make an emotional decision in a foreign language with other speakers of that language or other learners of that language?
When you say make a decision, do you mean like talk through a decision? Talk through the factors that...
Perhaps, and then ultimately make a decision at the end.
Right.
Because I think maybe that's a slightly different question, but whether or not we think in languages that specifically. Like, do I think to myself, I'm going to make this decision, or...
More of an instantaneous, in the moment
decision. Yeah.
Right.
So this idea of making a decision in foreign language, I wonder if it means kind of talking through it or...
Yeah. Do you have an experience?
Perhaps the only thing that I can think of is in my language school. I remember after I'd had a particularly bad lesson, it was the final day of my course, and they called me over and then asked me in Japanese what I was planning to do next with them. And what I really wanted to say was, I'm going to quit. I'm going to quit and go home. Right. But instead I had to sit and kind of come up with something. And yeah, I think that's probably the most emotional decision that I've had to make because of my mental state at the time.
Yeah.
So language affected your decision, would you say?
I think it kind of calmed me down in a way because I realised I couldn't just blurt something out because I didn't know how to blurt it out. So I had to sit down and figure out what I was going to say, which made me calm down a little bit and think through things a bit more rationally, perhaps.
Okay. Well, so there's been a study that was conducted by a group of academics to see if making decisions in a foreign language, are there any differences between the same decision in your native language and in your foreign language?
Right.
Okay.
And they wanted to find this out.
Yeah.
So they argue that in a foreign language, your cognitive fluency is reduced.
Right.
And you don't have as much access to emotional language, for example.
Yeah.
So perhaps your decision making is going to be altered.
Right.
That's the main hypothesis of this study.
Okay. Yeah.
So what they did is they conducted a trolley experiment. A trolley dilemma.
Right.
Are you familiar with trolley dilemmas?
Yes. Yeah, a little bit.
It's not a dilemma between which trolley to use in the supermarket.
Right.
That's not the dilemma.
No, you're always going to end up with the one with the bad wheel anyway.
End up with a faulty trolley. The trolley dilemma. So, for example, there's a train coming down the track. Perhaps it's going to crash. There's 5 people on the track. Do you let the train kill 5 people, or do you push the fat man that just happens to be standing next to you on the footbridge and kill him and save 5 people? So that's the sort of emotional trolley dilemma.
Right.
An example of one. So the researchers of this study, they gave that to a group of foreign language learners of English.
Right.
In English.
In English, yeah. So a Korean group, a Spanish group, a French group, and a Hebrew group, a group of learners from Israel.
Okay, interesting.
And they, first of all, they made sure that they understood the nature of the dilemma.
Okay.
In both languages.
I see.
Right.
Okay. And then they basically asked them what decision would they make. Okay. So they found that Okay, so for example, the difference with the Korean speakers in a native language condition, they didn't go for the utilitarian option.
Right.
Which would be to push the man.
They didn't go for
Right.
that. They elected to kill 5 people instead.
Right.
Okay.
Not kill 5 people. But,
Yeah.
let the
Not
train-
save 5 people.
Not save 5 people. However, the difference was when they were doing it in English. There was a difference of 7.5% towards a utilitarian option.
I see. So when they were speaking in English, they were more likely to choose the utilitarian option.
Yes.
7.5% more likely to choose the utilitarian option.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
And with the Hebrew group, it was a 65% difference
Right. Really.
towards the utilitarian option
Yeah.
in their foreign language. So they found clear differences
Yeah.
in the two, and they made assumptions whether this was a cultural prohibitions. So, for example, Korea and other East Asian nations are very collectivist.
Yeah.
So perhaps they'd opt for that option of killing more people over others
Right.
in this situation.
Yeah.
That's what the researchers argued.
Okay. I think that's a questionable conclusion.
Me too. Yeah.
So basically, they did 2 experiments. They did this first one. They said, well, perhaps this is an emotional response, and was there a response pattern that emerged? I.e., were they just making random choices because maybe they didn't fully understand, they didn't want to deal with the problem? Was it just a random decision that was made, basically? So they wanted to reduce this response pattern. So they did another experiment, same again, but this time they introduced a switch.
Okay.
So you simply press it, but you don't push the man. You press a button and something pushes the man for you.
Right. Yeah.
Very convenient.
Yeah.
And to do this study, they had 397 native speakers of Spanish who were learning English, and 328 native speakers of English that were learning Spanish.
Okay.
And they did the same study again. This time they found that the results were very similar.
Okay.
So they found that the less emotional experiment yielded kind of very nil responses, essentially. So they thought that perhaps the emotional side of it is affected by language, essentially.
Okay. That's interesting. I mean, that's kind of similar. I remember reading about linguistic schizophrenia. People who are very proficient in 2 languages, they tend to have different personality traits when they're engaged in speaking one language compared to another. I remember one particular story that sticks in my mind was of a woman who didn't actually like speaking to her children in her native language because she thought, in one of her languages, because she thought that that personality was too strict. And she didn't like interacting with her children in that way. So she chose one personality and therefore one language over the other. It's kind of similar to that, I guess.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm kind of skeptical about those things. I think, in that example, maybe it's possible, I guess. But I think even the person kind of making that decision, I wonder if she makes it more on kind of perceived differences.
Right.
I don't know. I've grown up with many bilinguals and not been too aware of those kinds of differences in personality.
Yeah.
The research that you were talking about, Matt. I was just trying to imagine like undergoing it myself.
Yeah.
And I think, if I was hearing the dilemma in a foreign language, probably a lot of your cognitive energy is taken up trying to really understand what the dilemma is. And then I also wonder if, because it is a foreign language, I don't know if it depends on the language so much, or that you're processing things differently because of that other language, but just the fact that it is a different code, a different way of expressing. I think maybe you're more likely to be a bit freer with your decisions, or I don't know.
So they make the conclusion that you're less affected by emotional aversion in your foreign language.
Right.
You don't have the same access to that you do in your mother tongue.
See, I wonder if I've said this before to you guys, not on a podcast, but when I'm speaking in Japanese, especially in the classroom, especially in a situation where I feel quite pressured to produce language, I don't say what I think. I say what I can say.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
And so I wonder if they're just saying what they can say. They're just saying something that's easy for them to say in the language without
Right.
them having to try and
It's
explain
related.
it. Maybe they're worried about having to give a complex explanation.
It might be related to this idea of the L2 self and what they're trying to portray
Right.
in their L2 ideal, arguably.
Possibly.
perhaps.
But yeah, I mean, to be honest, I go more that idea of just what they can do in the
What they can
language.
do.
Yeah. There's that great story about David Sedaris,
Yeah.
the humor writer. He has that story about, I think he was talking about Japanese, where he had a phrase book, and the only phrase, there was a question like, how's your family? And the answer is great. My wife is healthy, and my 2 kids are going to school. And so that's the only phrase. That's the only way he knew how to answer that question. So when people would ask him, that's how he would answer, even though he doesn't have a wife.
So
or
what he was
kids.
doing, he was just bridging a communication gap. Like he was just kind of
Right.
just filling that side to that side.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what I say in between.
Right.
I do that often. If I don't know the right word, I'll just grab.
Just make something
And
up.
sometimes that word
You're
is
still answering
like,
the question.
Yeah.
So if I was describing somebody and I didn't quite know how to say, well, they're not very friendly at times. I might just grab a word and say I hate them or something.
Right.
Just go
more
for what I've
simplified
got,
version.
basically. Yeah.
Exactly, and I guess this might be an extension of that. So it's not just trying to bridge a communication gap, but it's more complex. It's to do with the affective situation, the way that they're processing it, and how they feel they can safely respond to it when they're unsure of their own abilities in the language. Perhaps.
Right, because they might want to justify their choice, but
Exactly.
not have the language to do that appropriately.
Yeah.
I mean, the participants were screened and they were made aware of the study in their own language.
Right.
So they knew the nature of the study.
Right.
So it's not that
Right.
they didn't understand the decision that they were making.
Yeah.
Right.
But this idea of making the decision is the idea that in their groups they talked about it and then
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm sorry. I think they answered questions. I'm not
Right.
exactly sure, but I think they answered questions. They weren't giving any images.
Right.
They were just given the scenario in a paragraph form.
Yeah.
They may have spoke about it or they may have answered it.
Usually the way they do trolley problems is, I think, it's a kind of a one-on-one thing. It's researcher, participant. That's how I think they do it usually.
Okay.
Just to wrap up, some implications for this is obviously there's foreign language users, there's immigrants living in, for example, the UK, who do have to make emotional decisions on a daily basis.
Like with my language school.
Yeah. One example is being a member of a jury, for example. So this may be affected if your first language isn't English. Are you more likely to make better decisions for the good of the case?
Yeah. I wonder in the study if they took into account these learners' level of English and whether or not the stronger their English or the stronger their L2 was, the more closely it matched to their L1 answer.
Yeah, they rejected some participants because these are all adult learners. They've come at the language a lot later in life, so they don't have a history of language learning in this particular language. Finally, just to wrap up, we'd like to say thank you to somebody we're following on Twitter for bringing this story to our attention.
Yeah.
Okay, and that's today's TEFL News.
TEFL Pioneers.
This week's TEFL pioneer is Marion Rinvolucri, who I think might be a slightly controversial or surprise choice for a TEFL pioneer. But hopefully I can talk enough about him to explain why I think he does qualify. Okay. First of all, do you guys know anything about Rinvolucri?
I know absolutely nothing about him.
Okay.
Nothing at all.
First time you've heard the name?
I heard you mention him earlier, but that's about it.
I remember reading something by him when I did my DIP TESOL about learner styles. So, for example, kinesthetic learners, spatial learners.
Yeah, the idea of multiple intelligences.
Multiple intelligences, yeah.
Yeah, he has a book about that, an activities book, and I don't know. Yeah, but my feeling was that it was something that he became interested in for a while. I don't know if he's still pursuing that. Maybe he is. But what that does connect to is his interest in humanistic language teaching, instead of humanizing language teaching. A little background first. So he was born in 1940. He's still quite active as far as I know. He is more or less English, but his father was Italian and his mother was half German and half English.
Okay.
He was homeschooled up until the age of 13, which he says has some influence on him, that he made him kind of a more independent person, a natural self-starter.
Right.
but also not being a great socializer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know. He's one of those people. He always talks about how uncomfortable he is in a room full of people,
Right.
while, eloquently addressing a room full of people.
Yeah.
But, I guess there is a difference between talking to people rather than interacting with them. His career path to language teaching was slightly unusual, I guess. So he worked first as a sub-editor at Reuters,
Right.
writing articles, and I guess that's where he maybe developed his writing skills. And then I guess he was posted to Greece, to Athens, and I think to supplement his income for his young family, started teaching, and then kind of went into it that way.
Right.
He spent a bit of time teaching in Chile, under the Pinochet government.
Right. With the approval of the Pinochet government?
I guess so, yeah.
At the appointment of the Pinochet government?
I don't think so. Yeah. Or maybe until the Pinochet government. Maybe I have my...
Oh, he overthrew them. I see.
Yes. No. He ushered them in.
Right, okay.
But for a long time, since 1974, he has been working at Pilgrims, which is a school, mainly a teaching training institute in Canterbury, in the UK, in the southeast of the UK, and publishes online the Humanizing language teaching magazine, and has written many, many books. All of his books, as far as I know, are activities books. So
Right.
None of his books are explicit or just about theory. He wants to provide, practical things for the teacher. Yeah. And he's said in interviews that he was never really that interested in the kind of what he called waffly discussions of people like Widdowson.
Right.
And he really wants to just get down to the nuts and bolts of teaching.
Right.
Yeah. Have you come across any of his activities before?
Well, I mean, I think if I'm correct, the whole, multiple intelligences and adapting tasks or activities in your lesson to cater for a wide variety of learners in your
Possibly,
class.
yeah.
That's his thing.
A workshop that I which he ran about multiple intelligences, was more about raising the students' awareness of what their strong intelligence was,
Okay.
and then doing things with that. It wasn't necessarily because this student is a kinesthetic learner, I'm going to do this kind of activity. It was more putting the learners in touch with what might be their own strength.
See, this might be why I've never heard of him, because I kind of think multiple intelligences and learner styles, they're not really useful, and they're not well supported by any evidence.
Right. So I think, so again, I don't think it's necessarily about learner styles. From what I remember, he wasn't advocating, teach certain learners this way because that's how they learn. It was basically an activity. It was almost like content for the classroom.
Right.
Different people, and gave lots of examples. David Beckham is a kinesthetic. He's very intelligent kinesthetically. Some people are obviously very intelligent musically, etc. Some people are interpersonal. Some people are more intrapersonal.
Right.
Maybe not. It was more something to discuss among students instead to kind of identify.
I think people having certain strengths and weaknesses and certain good points and bad points in the ways that they learn, or just in their skills in general, I think that makes sense. But I've never really bought the idea that this really applies to how we teach. For example, if you've got a kinesthetic learner, how does it help them to learn a language? It doesn't seem to make sense to me.
Yeah.
So you mentioned his practical his practical works. What kind of examples?
So I guess his most famous book is Grammar Games. Which is when I was starting out as a teacher, it was a book that I often gravitated to.
Right.
Just because the types, and maybe this is why I consider him a pioneer, just the types of activities that you would find in his books tend to be very, very different from your normal English language activities.
Okay. Right.
Some of them were fairly standard things, but some of them were more unusual. So the one was a disappearing sentence.
Right.
So you put a long sentence on the board, and then students tell you which words can disappear from the sentence. And then you erase the word, and then you just keep reducing the sentence But the point is, each time you remove a word or a phrase, it still has to make sense grammatically.
Right. Okay.
And so you have a very long run-on sentence with lots of adjectives and,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
you know, subordinate clauses and everything,
Right.
and you reduce it.
Mm.
And then you can also build the sentence back up,
Right.
and that kind of thing.
Okay.
One of the similar activity, that was a long sentence, a similar activity was what he called the Marion Bat Game, which is, I don't know if you're familiar with the movie last year, Marion Bat.
No.
Alan Rene, maybe?
No.
Which, anyway, within the movie, there's a little game they put with matchsticks, and I guess he saw this little game they play, and he thought, how can I apply that to language teaching?
Right.
And so there's a little poem which matches the shapes of the matchsticks, and again, students remove one or two words. It's a game they play in groups.
Okay.
So very unusual kinds of games. Let's see, other examples, things like defining, so one is called Defining Birds and Brothers,
Right.
which is exactly what it sounds like. The students start with a sentence, a bird is, and then have to come up with a bunch of sentences. What is a bird?
Yeah.
What is a brother? Some of his other books, another book that he's maybe well known for is Once Upon a Time.
Right.
A lot of his materials he co-wrote. Once Upon a Time is mainly about storytelling, the importance of storytelling in language teaching.
Right.
And maybe I've kind of jumped ahead, but maybe the common thing of a lot of his materials is making the learners, basically not separating the learners as people from how they are as students.
Right.
If that makes sense. And he also advocates that for teachers.
Right.
He said several times he doesn't see any separation between his teacher self and his non-teacher self.
Right.
His work life and his non-work life. Everything informs each other, as it were.
Right. And so he's got he's obviously written a lot of materials which teachers can kind of pick up and use and that kind of thing. Do you think he's had much of an impact on the field in general? Do you think there's been a widespread impact, for example, in training courses or whatever?
Yeah, I think not. I think in a way he's a bit of an outsider.
Okay.
In certain circles, maybe in the UK where I spent a lot of time working, he's better known, or in Europe he's better known. Seems to be better known than here in Japan, for example.
Right.
And I don't know if it's mainly because he has, he doesn't write books about theory. He doesn't kind of engage in that side of things.
Right.
He wants to be a very practical teacher trainer, and at the same time, his ideas tend to be a little bit more esoteric. He wrote a book about using the mother tongue in the classroom.
Right.
He has an activity where you ask you put incorrect sentences of students L1, and you ask them to rate them of how incorrect are they.
Right.
Their own sentences in their own language. And then they do the same for English sentences.
Okay,
those kind of things. So the activities are very much about engaging the students on different levels, kind of intellectual levels, emotional levels, not just on language learning levels.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. Yeah.
Interesting.
I found a nice kind of bit of 3 points of advice that he would give to add to more teacher training.
Right.
That he thinks are important for teacher training. The first one is knowledge of your own person. So reflecting more on who you are as a person and how that informs who you are as a teacher.
Yeah.
Second is one-to-one teaching. He thinks that as an early bit of teacher training, just lots and lots of one-to-one teaching. And the third is cultural awareness, especially if you're going to go and work in another country.
Right.
What do you think about these three things? For example,
I think the third point is very important. Being culturally, I'm not sure what he means exactly, but being culturally aware of your context that you're teaching in. Not just, and other people have talked about this before. Maybe Stephen Bax, for example, of the Voynich manuscript fame, but a different. He talked about putting context before methodology. So thinking about the place you're in before the methodology, the paradigm, the CLT paradigm, for example. So I think that's very important. I guess that relates to the self as well.
Yeah. I think the one-to-one teaching point is also very interesting. So I remember when I started my teaching, I was doing it one-to-one. I found that a lot more instructive than with big groups, because with big groups you could quite often just say, just get on with it. Here's an activity, just get on with it.
Yeah, that's what he says. You can't hide behind a lesson plan.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think that's an interesting point, yeah. I think that would help you to become more aware of your teaching, become aware of what's working, what isn't, how your communication's developing, your communication skills. Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting point.
Yeah.
I kind of see at times, though, a difference between me as a teacher and me as a person. I think that when I'm in the classroom, as soon as the bell goes, I kind of switch this teacher hat on, and it's kind of like a show in a way, in a sense.
Yeah.
You know, and I know how things are going to work, how I'm going to speak, how I'm going to model my language.
Yeah.
So I don't. I mean, maybe in one-to-one teaching that might be different. A lot more personal.
Yeah.
Maybe.
I know what you mean. But do you feel that as you develop as a teacher, your non-teacher persona and your teacher persona come a little bit closer to each other?
I mean, somebody would have to observe me in both situations.
I've
to see.
observed you in both situations.
Okay, and what's your verdict?
I think you're quite similar to me. I think this might not be interesting for the listeners.
I'm sure it is.
But yeah, I think that
So rough example.
there is certainly a change in the way that you speak, the way that you present yourself. I think it does change when you're in front of people compared to when you're speaking to people in like the office at work. I think it's probably the same for me. I think that the way that I speak to my learners is different. But what I quite enjoy occasionally is dropping the mask just for a moment. I like letting the mask slip in the classroom and giving them a little taste of what I'm like, because it kind of livens things up a little bit, and I just show a little flash of personality and then retreat back again, and I think they quite enjoy that.
Right.
It can be motivating for the learners. Yeah.
Do you think a goal would be to reveal more of yourself? I mean, without sacrificing anything about being an effective teacher.
I think it would very much depend on the context I was in, on the culture I was in, cultural awareness.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, for example, I think when I started teaching in Japan, I was very young, and I tried to project an image of myself as an experienced, mature teacher, because teachers are expected to be experienced and mature and old and behave in a certain way, and I didn't want to be seen as this little youngling that didn't know what he was doing.
Right.
So I did try to project consciously an image, and I think that was the right thing to do.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It always reminds me of stand-up comedians. Often talk, like more experienced stand-up comedians often talk about this thing where when they start out, they're very much a persona on stage, and they have their it's just joke.
Right.
And then as they get older, they start to talk about themselves a bit more, and eventually, similar thing. Their on-stage persona and their off-stage persona more or less becomes the same thing.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we went slightly off topic from Rinvolucri. But he's our TEFL pioneer for this week.
TEFL Cultures. Today's TEFL culture is learner coaching. This was suggested to us by one of our listeners, Daniel Barber, who's actually written a book called From English Teacher to Learner Coach with another guy called Duncan Ford, which is published by The Round, which is a new independent ELT publishing collective. So we're going to be discussing some of the ideas that they talk about in the book. Don't worry though, this isn't a promotional thing. In fact, it cost me money to buy the book, so no money's changed hands except in that direction. So learner coaching is very similar to learner autonomy, which we're going to be discussing later on with Phil Benson on another podcast. But it kind of goes further. It envisages a shift in role for the teacher, so away from being an English teacher towards being more of a learner coach, someone who helps students to become better learners, both outside and inside the classroom, not as someone whose main duty is to teach the language. So just first impressions, how does that sound to you?
I mean, it sounds very similar to that shift from, teacher to facilitator, which has been happening for a while now, I guess.
Right.
Well, I mean, autonomous learning, self-access. Yeah, that kind of thing that's going on at the moment.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the reasons that they give, or the reasons that they argue that this is an important change to make, is that, well, there are a few. Firstly, there are many different kinds of courses, technologies, language learning resources available to students, which can help students to autonomously develop skills, right? But students perhaps need advice, need help in managing their time, in learning how to use these resources, and in learning which resources are best suited for optimizing their learning goals or for meeting their learning aims.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
So they give an example of, I think, I can't remember which one of them it is in the book, but one of their students is an older woman who has children in another country. So sometimes she's trying to write an email to them, sometimes she's trying to break into a very difficult novel. So lots of different strategies, but not really used in the best way for optimal learning. So they kind of argue that teachers need to focus more on helping students to become better learners, essentially. And they also argue that if learners can maximise their learning time outside of the classroom, they'll benefit more than they would from activities carried out inside the classroom just on their own. Yeah. So those are the reasons that they gave. And I think they kind of make sense. I think it makes sense on some level, at least. We can discuss later on what we think about it. So they give 3 different roles of a coach. First, motivation. So a coach should help to develop the motivation and harness the motivation of students. And the examples they give are offering choice of what you should do inside and outside class. So it's not just the teacher dictating what you should do, but it's the learners being able to engage in the decision-making process. Also encourage a sense of relatedness by working on a group dynamic and acknowledge improvements in competence with the learners. So that's the first part, motivation.
Okay. Acknowledge improvements in competence.
In second language learning competence.
Right.
And in language competence as well.
Okay. That would be a kind of assessment?
Kind of assessment, yeah, but I think also kind of a discussion, negotiation towards how they feel they've improved, where they've improved, what they've improved, that kind of thing.
I mean, just speaking personally, we kind of do that in our classes already, don't we?
Yeah,
we kind of make the learners aware of their feedback points, for example. I usually do that on a daily basis. Well, what have you improved? What do you need to improve? Giving them a bit of agency, essentially.
Yes, exactly. Well, I think that's a key point, is giving them agency. So motivation is the first thing that they say that a coach should be doing. The second point is organising and setting goals. So very often they say, a teacher goes into the classroom, they do a needs analysis, they work out the goals of the group as a whole. So they're arguing more for individual goals. You work with students to help them supplement their classwork in order to pursue their particular learning agenda.
Okay.
Yeah. And they argue specifically, and this feeds into what we do a little bit, I think, the goals should always be specific, measurable, agreed, so agreed between teacher and learner, I guess, realistic and time-bound, so something that can be done within a specific length of time, which is, that makes the acronym SMART.
So it's kind of contract, a learner contract or teacher contract.
I think it's similar to
between
that.
the learner and the teacher.
Yeah. And the final part, or the final role of the coach, is to practice, to encourage and monitor students. So let learners speak about their learning in the class, get them to share ideas, tell them about recommended resources, get them to share ideas for recommended resources, and so on. So those are the 3 roles of the coach: motivation, organising and setting goals, and practice, encouraging and motivating students.
Okay.
So what do you think about that?
To me it doesn't sound very radical or anything. It sounds what a lot of teachers consider part of their job anyway.
Right.
Is the idea more that in terms of specific, maybe what we would consider more traditional language learning, things like learning how to, write an essay or something, or learning how to have more accurate grammar. Those are things that the students should figure out for themselves?
Well, I think that's an interesting question. They do have suggestions in the book for how you can help students develop things like writing and so on. I can't remember off the top of my head exactly what they suggest, but they do address that. Yeah.
I guess it would be like trying to ride a bike for the first time, rather than the mother or the father saying, you need to turn the wheels, okay, keep coming. It would be like the learner falling off the bike and realizing, okay, I need to get back on the bike. I need to do this again. That was a mistake. I need to do this again. And you're actually telling the learners to look out for those points themselves, perhaps. Maybe.
Well, I think what it's more about.
Kind of analogy.
Yeah.
I think maybe the analogy they prefer is more of a sports analogy. So a coach doesn't see the players on a team, every day. They're not there. They don't tell them exactly how to kick the ball. What they do is they coach them. They see them and then they tell them how to go away and how to train and how to prepare and how to ready themselves best for the next game, right? I think that's the analogy they prefer to use, which is, I guess, why they use the term learner coach.
Right.
Yeah. Perhaps to give some more specific examples, they have a list of differences between a regular classroom and a learner centre or a learner coaching environment.
Yeah.
So, in a regular classroom, the teacher's role is to teach English and to set homework, whereas in a learner coaching environment, the teacher's role is to help the learners achieve their goals with English.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can the two coexist?
Well, what do you think?
Yeah, I think the two can coexist, can be the same thing.
Right.
It seems like maybe different. I mean, okay, maybe homework isn't always a part of it, or and maybe that traditional thing of the teacher's role is to teach English is maybe a too simplistic a way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
So maybe their idea is thinking more about the steps needed to get to that point.
Yeah. Well, I think the two key points are, so the first one, in a regular classroom, the teacher's role is to motivate classroom learning, so a focus on the classroom. Whereas in a learner coaching situation, the teacher's role is to motivate learners to practice English more outside the classroom.
That's interesting. Yeah.
So the learners come to you, and rather than you focusing specifically on what's happening in the classroom, you're focusing more on helping the learners to achieve their goals outside of the classroom, to achieve their learning aims outside of the classroom.
That's a very interesting idea. And yeah, we attended that talk in the summer about the extended classroom, and that idea of that, if learners only spend the time in our classroom learning English, it's not enough hours to reach the right point. And so I think that's a very interesting idea, motivating learners to practice more outside the classroom. It seems like the reason why it's an important idea and a difficult idea is that it is very difficult to do.
Yeah.
Do you think this approach would work better in some contexts than others? Like, for example, just one example, maybe Sweden, where they have English as their second language. They're being exposed to it anyway.
Yeah.
So if the teacher as coach gives them the tools, they'll make use of that language that's around them.
Yeah.
But in Japan, I mean, maybe it seems harder to. Or maybe we need coaches more so in order to.
I was thinking about this. I was thinking about it from my learning perspective. If I went to one of my classes and the teacher spent a lot of time telling me how I could best utilise my time outside of class, if I'm being honest, I wouldn't do it. If I'm being honest, because I'm a busy man. I've got things on. I think it depends what the student expects. It depends how much time the student has. It depends what resources are available, and it depends on the context. Yeah, I think you're right.
So for us learning Japanese in Japan, I'd want to go to a class an hour a week. Give me the vocab or the grammar that I need, for example, and I'd want the teacher to kind of say to me, so you've got this language, why don't you go out and try and use this? Actually work on it, do something with it. I'd want the teacher to encourage me to do that.
Right. Yeah,
I guess that's my compromise, perhaps. I don't know.
Yeah, and I mean, if you have a certain number of classroom hours with students, how many of those hours are devoted to explaining how to practice English more outside the classroom?
Yeah, well, they do say that, they're not saying don't teach them anything, but they're saying devote more time to this. So what they say, another difference between the two classrooms, in a regular classroom, homework is an expected addition to classroom learning, whereas in this situation, classroom learning is an expected addition to the students' English language lives. So it's kind of the cherry on the cake, I guess, in a way.
Right.
Another point that I liked was in a regular classroom, the objective of the lesson is to learn English, whereas in a learner coaching situation, the objective of the lesson is to learn some English and support the students in learning more outside of class. So I think that's the crucial difference. We were trying to figure out what the difference was. I think that's the crucial difference. Is that it's less about the classroom experience, it's more about how the classroom experience can help inform the language life outside the classroom.
Which I think it's a great idea. It seems, maybe like you said, and you're a fairly motivated language learner, and yet still maybe would find it difficult to...
Still not very good.
no, but still find it difficult to devote enough time outside the classroom. And so, I mean, if you get a great coach who's incredibly motivating and can, get everyone fired up to... But, like you say, people have lives. They only have so much time to devote to language learning. that to me maybe seems like the one. It seems kind of idealistic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess it depends if you're... I guess maybe that's the challenge of the coach, is to try and find ways of motivating learners and trying to find ways to help them to take advantage of the resources around them and to want to take advantage of the resources around them as well. Yeah.
I guess extensive reading is one example.
Yeah.
Just a final question. Does the coach have to be a second language or foreign language learner? Do they have to be doing the same thing?
I think, like in any kind of language teaching, it helps. I would suggest it helps because it makes you aware of the kind of situations your learners might be facing. But I guess, like with any other kind of language learning situation, it may not be completely necessary. But I guess it helps. I think it always helps to be learning languages.
Yeah. Is it quite clear in the book the kinds of skills that a coach needs versus a teacher?
Yeah, they go into quite a lot of detail about it. And there's also a student's book as the second half of the book, which you can give to students to help students engage in this process as well.
Okay. I wonder if a less experienced traditional English language teacher would make a better coach if they don't bring the usual baggage.
Well, perhaps so. Yeah. But yeah, I think it's an interesting idea, and if anyone's interested in checking that out, please go and read the book From English Teacher to Learner Coach. And that's the TEFL culture for this episode.
Thank you very much for listening to today's episode. As always, if you'd like to get in contact with us, you can follow us at TEFLology on Twitter, or you can email us at teflology@gmail.com.
So it's goodbye from me.
Goodbye from me.
Goodbye.